Hello and welcome to Beyond GDP, the Social Progress Podcast, where we're talking to people from government, business and civil society who are trying to create better communities and a better planet. In today's programme, we're going to be focusing on the issue of how do we heal divisions in our society. Social Progress Index data is clear that declining rights and growing intolerance are having a negative effect on social progress globally and fueling a rise in authoritarian populists who are really implementing programs that seem to be setting the world backwards. So how do we actually build inclusive societies? How do we heal divisions? We know there's a lot of anger. We know there's a lot of division between people. How do we tackle that? How do we bring people together? Well, my guest today, Anwar Akhtar of the Samosa Media, knows all about that. He's an educator, he's an arts impresario, all focused, working in Britain on bringing together black and minority ethnic communities, BME communities, and other communities around shared cultural and educational heritage. Anwar is really someone who knows the story on the front line, is someone who's really worth listening to. Anwar, it's a great pleasure to have you on the Beyond GDP podcast. You are very much on the front lines tackling division and extremism within British society. I think what I'd really like to start with is, from your perspective, I think this is relevant beyond Britain to many other countries, and find out what is driving this division and extremism that really is sort of pulling apart the fabric of our societies and is becoming an ever bigger problem.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. If you take a slightly glass half full analysis of that, I would say that we are facing really strong challenges around division, populism, people exploiting the horror, and what I think is, if not a genocide, close to a genocide in Gaza, the horrific death toll of the Palestinians and the state of those poor people in Gaza living in literally, horrendous conditions, and the consequential health and disease and poverty and the increasing death toll because of that, and the sheer brutality of what Israel has done to a civilian population in Gaza. So I think there's lots of genuine anger. And I also think there is division in communities. And I think there is people that are exploiting those divisions. And on one level, it's fairly straightforward. The optics, are quite clear to see. You've got GB News, you've got right-wing groups and hedge funds that have decided to demonize and target Muslim communities in Europe as the other, not belonging. And, the amateur historian in me says, going on since the Crusades, nothing new here. And then you've also, I think, got very robust anti-racist civil society and campaign groups that are pushing back. So we've got a very brutal, nasty, vicious culture war going on, really, around some things that have been with us for a very long time, around race, integration, identity, religion, migration. And I think there's stuff happening that is very much of our times around globalization and where we are with societies, and particularly in Europe and the States. So you can't have globalization without people movement and diversity and multiculturalism. That's the story of trade and empires for millennia. And I always say Britain became a multicultural society sometime around, was it 1740, when Robert Clive landed in Mumbai in the whole process of colonization and the East India Company. It started with stealth and trade and local treaties and local trading arrangements, and then providing security for one or two princes and one or two rulers. And before you know it, it was full-on colonization and exploitation. And we all know that story. And, about 250 years after that, my parents left the Punjab in what was then Pakistan in the 1960s, was formerly part of India. and landed in Manchester. And you look at Manchester's communities and diversity, and you look at the impacts of trade in particular on Manchester and Cottonopolis. And most of, not most, but a large part of Manchester's textiles and retail and commercial sector is now worked in, run by British Asians and British Muslims and British Pakistanis. And in many ways, that's similar to the story of Jewish migration. You arrive with very little, and some folk go off to set off Marks and Spencer. So I think there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of positivity around the way Britain has handled culture and migration and race and integration. And large parts of that, I think, this kind of, I have to find it quite funny because I teach this, and I often find myself smirking and chuckling as I teach it. And I know, but I mean, I think one of the reasons why Britain has actually handled race and culture and integration and migration very well is just the brilliance of the British political establishment at reinvention. So we went from, let's not talk about empire, let's talk about the Commonwealth. We're all in it together now. Come and have tea with the Queen or the King, at Buckingham Palace, and have a garden party, and let's have gospel choirs at Westminster Abbey as part of our royal kind of events and ceremonies now. I think Britain was very good at kind of moving away from the brutality of empire into sort of, we've got these shared common relationships and shared citizenship and shared heritage. And I think there's an element of one nation Toryism, and there's an element of the Labour Party that's handled that very, very well. And, let's not talk about where the stuff in the British Museum came from. Let's talk about our shared culture and our shared heritage. And I think to an extent that's actually been very positive. And I think Black and Asian communities in Britain have actually been given ladders and routes into citizenship and ownership of the polis and being part of the culture and part of that community, and almost a respect from the British establishment. I mean, the other part is Britain's Black and Asian communities have fought very, very hard for their rights, and we should talk about the impact of Macpherson and Scarman and the anti-racist movement. And I think that's made us a very sort of tolerant, inclusive society in many, many ways. And we see that in the representation of Black and Asian parliamentarians and leaders, and contrast with France, and contrast our, and I think there's an interesting conversation there. Now, having said all that, I think the world changed after 9/11. And I think one of the things that for, a British-born Pakistani Muslim in his 50s, all my experience of racism was the National Front, the BNP, some quite forceful comments from Norman Tebbit about cricketing loyalties. We all remember Thatcher's swamping speech. And that's very, very different from working class young Muslims in Manchester and Bradford and Birmingham and London today, where the world is seen through a prism of Islamophobia. It's seen through a Hollywood narrative that has demonized Muslims in a way that's not far off how Jews were being demonized in 1920s, 1930s Europe, And I think it's worth, now that might be very forceful, some might wince at that, but what I would say is put yourself in the mind of a working class child in Bradford or Birmingham and see how the world views, how you see yourself reflected in the media as the enemy within, as an alien, as always the baddie in every Hollywood movie, and things like London Has Fallen and all that kind of Hollywood 24 narrative. And then also think about, and that explains why there's more religiosity amongst working class Muslim communities in Britain, because then the message goes out, we're under threat, it's the Crusades again. They want to wipe out Islam. And it gets, so you see more people you see more boys with beards and 3/4 length trousers, and that's very much about religious identity, right? That's very much almost, it's not dissimilar from when the Protestant community feels under threat in Northern Ireland. The bands get louder and the bonfires get bigger, because it's everyone man the barricades, we're under a threat, and that can. So I think, having said all that, I think we're doing quite well. I actually think we're doing very well. But the point that you're right to raise is we face very, very serious threats.
So these threats, are really around the sort of different extremists, almost at opposite poles to each other, who have a common interest in dividing us because they will do better if there's conflict. So come on, tell us how you're trying to tackle these extremists on both sides in your work with the Samosa media.
So we do a lot of work around British Asian history and Black and Asian history, and that's in large part because I was in a very privileged position of having been the producer of the play Dara for the National Theatre, or production consultant and producer all combined. And that was a huge, huge juggernaut of a project because it was the first Muslim Sikh Hindu history play translated from Urdu and Punjabi on the main stage at the National. And it had a very significant impact. It's now very close to joining, it got compared to The Crucible and Hamlet. And it's about to become a companion piece for The Crucible in A-level drama because it opens up a whole series of conversations about power, history, religion, authority, state. And so
Just tell people quickly what the story's about. I think that's quite important.
So, I mean, very briefly, it's a moment in Indian history that's very comparable to Charles I and Cromwell, or Mary, Queen of Scots and Elizabeth. It's a moment where tensions between rulers around religion and state imploded. So it's seen as a battle that laid in many people's minds the seeds for the later partition of India and Pakistan. So it was, Dara was, in a sense, a very liberal Muslim prince who was about to inherit the great Mughal throne after Shah Jahan with the 16th century. So all that power. And he had very close relationships and friendships with Hindu preachers and leaders and Sikh gurus, and whereas Aurangzeb, his younger brother, took a more kind of Islamic superior supremacy approach. There was a civil war between them to inherit the Mughal Empire, and Dara won. And a lot of people see that as a moment that tensions between Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu erupted because the Mughals were very much, in some ways, like the Romans. They were very good. Mughal rulers would marry Hindu princesses, have Sikh generals, and they say the Mughals came to India and invaded and became Indian, whilst the English came to India and remained English. So, and then the Mughal Empire split, and Aurangzeb won the war and basically persecuted Hindu and Sikh leaders. I think he beheaded one of the founders of the Sikh religion, and in very working class, similar to the Battle of the Boyne in Northern Ireland. It's a moment that has huge resonance amongst working class communities. And India today, obviously, Modi is all about trying to diminish the Mughal legacy and the Mughal story, whilst Pakistan have regiments in the army named after Aurangzeb. So it's a very visceral live history that's here with us today. And so the impact of putting that on the main stage, and if you like, there's lots of Greek and Roman and European history plays in the English canon. No shortage of stories about the Tudors, and so to have the first Muslim Sikh Hindu history play in the English language canon that was on the main stage at the National and then has now been filmed for National Theatre Live, had a huge educational impact, which brings me to, I've gone off on a bit of a Dara story there. There's much more available online, and perhaps I can share some links to the film and the play on social media. That brings me to diversity in the curriculum, which is where we've been doing a lot of work. Because of my background at Rich Mix as well, I've always been asked to go into schools and sixth forms and give talks and workshops.
Tell us quickly what's Rich Mix.
So Rich Mix was a huge art space in East London that was built in 2005, £30 million, 60,000 square feet of cinemas, gallery, workspace, community media space, youth spaces. And I was a director that oversaw its development and helped set it up and launch the charity, and oversaw an investment from the Arts Council and the Millennium Commission. So this was lottery money, London Development Agency, the Mayor's Office for London. And it was, in a way, the first national BME-led arts cultural space. And it's still, I'm very pleased and proud to say, operating 25 years later. So it's part of the national firmament now. It's, like the Whitechapel Art Gallery or the Whitworth Art Gallery or, Sadler's Wells Theatre. It's off that scale and respect and reputation. And I was the founder director. So I've got the grey hairs to show it as well. It was, it was any large scale cultural regeneration project, managing community politics, race, identity, and huge sums of public money. And I'm very proud that it came in on time, on budget, and, has been what, and it was, I must emphasize this, team effort. There was a group of about 10, 12 people that dedicated several years to making Rich Mix happen. And I was lucky to be the director that was the kind of public face and had the leadership role in that. So I spent a lot of time in schools and universities, and mainly sixth form, 16 plus. It was a friend of mine that said, the work that you're doing, there's lots of, I must credit Jane Barmore with this. She said that, there's lots of noise and chatter and culture wars about diversity in the curriculum. Dr. Jane Barmore teaches media and art at Westminster University. But there's actually very little content. There's very little that actually that we can use in classrooms with our students. And, work like Rich Mix, work like Dara, the stuff that we've done with Radio 4, that's teaching material. That's actually really powerful. And my diary was becoming almost 50%, during term time. Will you come to this school? Will you come to this sixth form? Will you come to this university? And much of this is friends, colleagues that are academics, that are teachers, that are youth workers. And it struck me that I started thinking, because I'm a bit of a noisy bugger and quite inquisitive. And I started thinking about diversity in the curriculum, because I never really given much thought to it. In my 30s and 40s, it was all about building things or producing plays or setting up projects and, owning space and so on, owning space, venues, resources. Education was something it was nice to go and talk about my work, and I found it, as someone that was a bit of a teenage tearaway, the idea of being a role model filled me with some bemusement in, my older years. But one of the things that struck me was, if you actually look at teaching materials in British schools, given the impact that Britain's BME communities have had on our national story and our island story, there's shocking little, and so the left have got a point with, I think it's not helpful when you rage about it, but the left have got a really profound point about our curriculum is so Eurocentric. Especially in places like Birmingham and Bradford, where you've got schools that, have got large BME populations, if the teachers are all white and the curriculum's all white, and your only engagement is with white people in the context of some didactic authority and overseeing power, that can be quite alienating. And I actually started looking at this, and it was like, okay, great, Othello, Shakespeare. I don't want to get contentious about this, but I'm not sure he's great role model material, despite the importance of the play. And then you've got Kill a Mockingbird. Yeah, and that's pretty much it, actually, in the literature. And so I started thinking about how can we get more stuff into schools. I started talking to teachers who are incredibly hardworking, and I think one of the things that I've learned, and I've seen it, is we're in danger of destroying one of our most precious resources, which is our teachers, with this burden of exams and stats and quantitative analysis of what's actually a very qualitative process, which is passing on knowledge. You couldn't put what I've said to you into a pie chart with some stats. And, and I think we've gone wrong somewhere in teaching, where we've overburdened stats and exams and quantitative data.